Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Growth Leap. I'm your host Michel Gagnon. We talk to pretty awesome business builders who are designing disruptive and meaningful companies. Is there a way to finance your startup growth without losing your shirt and the control of your company? Well, our guest today believes so. In fact, she even has a solution ready for you. Julia Profeta Johansson is co-founder and chief investment officer at Conscious Growth, a Berlin-based company that offers founder-friendly, non-dilutive lending. She wants to accelerate how technology, business, and investments generate social and environmental impact. So if you're looking for a smarter kind of growth for your business, well, that's the right episode for you. Hope you enjoy. All right, Julia, it's a pleasure having you with us. Thank you so much for joining us on the show. How are you?
I'm good. It's my pleasure to be here with you, Michelle. Thank you so much for the invitation.
It's a pleasure. Let's get started right away. You co-founded earlier this year Conscious Growth, which you describe as the first conscious entrepreneurship bank with founder-friendly, non-dilutive lending. Can you tell us a bit more about the company and what's the value proposition?
Yeah, sure. So actually, the company started a bit earlier than this year. It was end of last year. And then I joined Sebastian as his co-founder beginning of this year, as our minds sort of connected into creating something in greater whenever we're looking at the challenger bank space and whatever startups are actually lacking, and the role that we see that companies actually have when we're talking about the sustainable development goals, for instance, and all the impact challenges that we have. So the idea is that through conscious growth, we enable mainstreaming impact, meaning how is it that we can bridge this gap and really reach and talk to many more companies when it comes to impact without having all the labels, bells and whistles that so many times impact investors come to the table, but at the same time allowing us through funding and financial products and services to really inspire, incentivize these companies to become a bit more impactful, regenerative, and in the end of the day, sustainable as well.
Great. And what kind of financial product are you offering at the moment?
So at the moment, we are offering revenue-based finance. So that's how we started. And we've been developing on the side the accounts and the cards as well. So the idea is by the end of the year, we're going to be able to allow and offer all the bank suite kind of products and services. So we're serving right now digital companies that have a lot of marketing investments, for instance. So we're doing short-term revenue-based finance, which is essentially a loan that is repaid through a percentage of the revenues that a company generates in the future.
Another in part of the value proposition is the speed at which you can process application and offer the financing. Can you tell us a bit about how that works?
Yeah, sure. So essentially, we are trying to break down this pattern of taking forever for you to bring funds for your company. So since the beginning, we have been structuring everything to be pretty much tech enabled and data driven, so that we can really have full transparency and quickly make a decision whether we want to finance a company or not. So once a company comes to us, they go through our sign up flow, and there they have the option to really plug in or their data connection. So bank accounts, payment processors, digital marketing accounts. And that, we managed to understand what's been the performance of the previous months, and we can start predicting what could actually happen in the coming months. So along with that, we combine a simple basic P&L to understand what are the plans of the companies. We have a few extra questions to understand the profile of clients and suppliers, which are things that you can properly capture only with data. So we give a bit more color in there. And then within 2 weeks, more or less, we are able to disperse the loan if everything goes accordingly. So we're trying to automate as much as possible, but still continue to maintain this human touch. And that's why we always have a call or a meeting or something like that. But so many of our clients are not based in Berlin anymore. So that means that we end up having many Zoom calls.
Yes, well, you're not the only one. Are there specific, I think you briefly touched on this earlier, but are there specific eligibility criteria or, you've talked about digital-based businesses. Are you focusing on, specific type of business or verticals?
We are looking essentially at some business models. So when I talk about like digital business models, I'm talking about e-commerce, SaaS, subscription, marketplace, apps to begin with, right? And I think that one important like component whenever we're talking about like revenue-based finance, our take is that you need to have revenues already for us to be able to finance you, right? So we're looking at companies that have at least 6 months of revenues so that we can understand what's like the behavior, because in the end of the day, if you don't have any revenues, it's very hard to like tell what's the performance, what's like the unit economics of your business. So different from like banks that normally want to see profitability, what we want to see is good unit economics. So for instance, if like a company invests €1 in marketing and has 2, 3, 4 euros like of revenues, then that means that it's a healthy company. And in a sense that if we go into a revenue based agreement, I won't be harming or damaging their potential performance. So this is like one of the things that we're looking at. And also another important element of whenever we talk about like alternative funding is understanding what's the stage of the company and what are like the different like capital needs it might have. Because many times companies tend to think that revenue-based finance is gonna like solve all their problems. And in the end of the day, it's one more like alternative funding that you have at your hands, right? It's another source, but it's not the sole one that one should have, right? So we encourage, still like having some kind of equity investment or eventually like longer debt also, and using revenue-based finance as like a leverage for your growth.
One of the things that we're always interested in, like everybody who's building a business, is talking about traction, product market fit. What I'd like to know is what kind of strategy have you put in place to acquire clients at Conscious Growth?
This is an awesome question. And we started with a proof of concept, right? So I think, as you just mentioned, like understanding what your client actually needs before even like going out is one of the most fundamental things. So for us, starting with revenue-based finance was really like tapping into a very specific need of the companies, which is always like funding and really assessing alternative sources. So at the beginning, we start like really reaching out to understand, okay, what would make sense for you? What is the most simple kind of contract that we can come up with? And at the beginning, while you're like shaping up your product, I think one of the best strategies is really reaching out to your own networks. So what we decided to do was like at the beginning to really start working with some multipliers. So be it like co-working spaces, accelerators, some VCs, some like angel investors that could really like recommend us companies that could fit into our criteria. So that's how we acquired our like over like 10 clients so far. So we have a portfolio of like over 15 financings and like everything going super well so far. And now the strategy going forward continues like pretty much like based also on these like multipliers, especially because we're talking about like a new kind of product still. So revenue based finance is still something that is not so well understood in Europe. It's starting like to pick up. It is super well developed in the US. So there is a lot of education that has to be done. So that's why one of our strategies is also like investing a lot into community building, into content generation, so that clients and like potential partners, they can become more familiar and more comfortable with the concept. So I think these are all like pieces that we have been putting together for the past year so that we can really like open up the funnel with the PR in the coming like more or less 8 to 9 weeks, I would say. And then in October, properly have, like all the banking features also open for clients to start with. And then beginning of next year for like all kinds of businesses to also have their bank accounts and cards with the all conscious features embedded into them.
Just before, I want to talk about impact investment, but just before you talked about funding or revenue-based financing being still, a new product. I saw a few days ago on Twitter, someone who I forgot the name, saying that the internet really needs a good book on non-VC funding for startups. He was saying, if you want to write it, I know who would publish and distribute it. Since you've worked, I believe you started investment banking, you've done private equity, and also been in the VC world. Would you say that there's a revolution happening, or at least that we're due for a revolution in the world or funding for startups?
Definitely. And I think this is like one of the conversations we've been having for quite some time now. Like it's quote unquote, debt is coming. So by like quoting actually like another investor who wrote an article about this. And I think that especially since the whole like impact investing movement started, a lot more has been brought to the table and really questioning many of the principles of VC. So even when I was a part of this VC fund in Brazil, we used to always use a word in Portuguese that has like two meanings eventually, or let's put it that way. The verb to be has two meanings in Portuguese, right? And we used to say that we were VCs as is a transitory verb, not
Mm-hmm.
as a permanent state of being, because we truly understand that there is like a transitioning going on, and that sometimes you need to use like mechanisms and vehicles that are a bit more familiar to investors. Why are you create the revolution until you're in a phase and a place where you say, well, you see, it works. Now, what about we come up with like different structures, you know?
It's like stealth mode tactic, right?
Exactly. So like getting to understand the system from within. So which is somehow what I did also with my career, you know, like understanding how the dark side of the force actually works so that we can somehow use it against itself. So like coming back to like being a banker in a sense, it's something, you know, like fulfilling the whole like journey of like, okay, I understand. I've been through like different kind of like positions and roles before. And now we get to this place where we understand what it means to like reshape banking. We understand what are some of the basic like principles that we have to like shift in order to really create an ecosystem that's like healthier for companies, is healthier for like people on the planet. And we can like bring this all together with a financial platform that in the end of the day will have the means through, you know, like making money go back and forth, actually create some kind of additional value to society and the planet as well. So in that sense, I see that many principles of venture capital, which is like total like exit driven, trying to like really raise like valuations as much as possible, as soon as possible. These are not principles that are really like adding lasting value, right? So we have to question these fundamentals. We have to question what kind of returns are we expecting? Because in the end of the day, the VC industry is able to like fund what, like 5% of all deal flow, if even, right?
Mm-hmm.
What do we do with the rest of the 95% of the companies, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, like so much of the dynamics behind, you know, like valuations that sometimes you just like question, how come this company has reached, I don't know, 50 million euros already of valuation without not even having a proof of concept out? And then just like, wow, there's something like weird going on. So you have like many of these elements that we have like to question. And then they end up really like driving strategy towards the wrong directions, right? So
Mm-hmm.
this is where we have to really like rethink. And I like the impact investing take. Maybe this can be like a good segue into it, where it is not only like seeking returns, like financial returns at all costs, but also understanding that we can truly incorporate the social environmental aspects into it and having
Mm-hmm.
ways of intentionally seeking for both at the same time. And I think one of the biggest changes in thinking is the short term against the long term. So many times all these decisions within the VC world is trying to maximize value on the short term, but not necessarily they're going to really bring value at the long term. While with the impact investing lens, theoretically, what we are like looking at is like maybe sometimes you have to go a bit slower and the short term so that you can really create something that's robust, is long lasting in the long term. So I think this is like one of the principles that impact investing starting I really like to trigger. And of course, you can always argue, wow, how do you translate intentionality, right? So
Mm-hmm.
for me, it's a lot about you have to be able to measure that, right? So intentionality has to be translated into KPIs. It has to be translated into targets. It has to be translated into your like strategy roadmap.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's just an externality.
You mentioned that you kind of started on the dark side of the force, your career. But it took a different turn. I think you joined the Yunus Social Business, an organization from Muhammad Yunus, who's a Peace Prize winner. And is also, I think we could call him the father of microfinancing and social business.
Yeah.
And then you ended up really focusing on impact investing. And as you said, the Global Impact Investing Network defines impact investment as investments made with the intention, like you mentioned, to generate positive, measurable social and environmental impact alongside a financial return. The financial return element of it is, we're used to it. You can argue, as you said, that, crazy valuation is not the right way to go. But when we start thinking about social and environmental impact, you've talked about KPIs. Do you have practical advice on how tech startups can identify, measure, and report on those KPIs without necessarily having to hire an army of people.
If you start with your vision of the company, you can envision not only what's like the business success, but also what are the social environmental outcomes that you would like to see. So I always like to say there is like the vision of the impact that you want to create, and that you have to understand, okay, what do I have at hand? What kind of products and services am I creating? And who am I serving with those? And then the first level that you would have is like operational KPIs is essentially, let's talk about like an ed tech. So how many kids are using my new educational gaming to teach social emotional skills? Let's put it that way. So you can have like just like a very clear number. So like my goal here is like to reach, I don't know, like 1 million kids in the English speaking countries, for instance, right? And then my question would be, is this somehow a proof of impact? It's not, right? So like just allowing access most of the times won't be impact
Yeah.
because you're not bringing an additionality to the table.
Mm-hmm.
And this is another like interesting word within the whole like impact framework, which is how is it that you're improving the lives of your customers had they not have your solution? So essentially, what I just mentioned, like the number of kids using the platform, this would be an output. So that's an
Mm-hmm.
operational kind of like result of what you're doing.
Yeah.
And then the level of the outcome is actually, so how have these kids improved their relationships with their friends? And this is where actually you will have for now like a combination of like quantitative and qualitative inputs. And there is, for instance, the B Corps. I don't know if you heard of them with the
Yeah.
whole like the B assessment, which is something super comprehensive, which allows the company to go through like a full X-ray of where they're at and what are like potential like next steps they can do. And then looking more specifically into the customers, which in the end of the day is what we are gonna, one of the ways of defining impact, which is like your business has to be solving a social environmental issue, right? So like normally your customer, how you relate to them will be the direct impact. And then there you have like actually an array of like a lot of indicators that somehow are agreed upon with the iris, for instance. So there are like several like benchmarks that one can start like using and looking to understand what is actually applicable to my reality. And I would say that it's something that it's very like personal in a sense. It's something very particular for each startup in the end of the day. So you can have like two kind of educational startups or I don't like climate tech companies, which have like somehow like different targets and different aims in the end of the day. So the challenge then it's up to like the impact investors, which will have to somehow make their like portfolio analysis be a bit more comprehensive and a bit more respect a bit more the differences of the different companies.
To bring the people on the dark side of the force on the brighter side, what is missing? Because you've talked about a very different mentality or mindset in terms of how you actually run and measure the success of a business. In a different episode, I talked to Lubomila from Plan A. We basically said, look, VCs are still focused on a certain investment criteria that are not necessarily conducive to saving the planet. So, from your work, what do you feel is missing, or what are the key things we need to fix to improve how we run businesses?
So I think we are in a process, you know, and normally these processes with the mainstream, they are triggered by chaos or catastrophes in a
Yeah,
sense, or when you have a shift.
pandemics.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And when you have like a shift in the consumer base or in the client base,
Hmm.
right? So for instance, we saw like lately all the environmental catastrophes like actually starting to happen and starting to impact absolutely everybody in the world. And one might even say that like COVID somehow has also its relations to how we have been like dealing with all these aspects, you know? So all of a sudden, once the start like the water starts like raising, everybody starts looking around, oh, what have we done wrong? So it is like a moment that we have this opportunity of like speeding up the perception that we need to take much more into consideration than only profits, right? And I think that once you start having also economic arguments, so meaning talking the same language as the mainstream, you also start like onboarding more people. So what happened is like maybe this whole like impact movement, like profit and impact, it's now maybe 10, 15 years old. So it's quite new. So now we are starting to really like see the results and the fruits of investing with a different kind of lens. And we're proving that, wow, it's not either or. There is a new way of doing that. And also, I think there is like a big difference in the whole society with like millennials becoming more relevant and women also inheriting more money. So, for instance, if I'm not mistaken, it was like Goldman Sachs that a few years ago they launched the $30 trillion challenge, which is essentially the amount of wealth which will transition hands in the coming decade. And understanding that this new generation that's gonna own the capital now thinks
Hmm.
differently. So I think we have been like evolving the like Maslow pyramid in a sense. And I see like many of my former colleagues understanding, like realizing, wow, what kind of values do I actually have? So like one of my triggers is like, it's always asking what kind of future do you want to create? So
Hmm.
I think if we want to like shift something, I'm much more in favor of the positive narrative than like shaming and blaming everybody.
Yeah.
So I think whenever you just like start like blaming, you've been doing everything wrong, people go to the defensive. So what we have to say is like, wow, we need a new way of doing it. So it worked for that long time. And now if we don't do something, it won't work anymore. Right. So I think it is a moment of like coming out more clear with like narratives that are really like reinforcing the upside for everybody once we have this kind of like positive take on what, like social environmental engagement actually mean. That it doesn't mean that you have to be, like this tree hugger essentially to be doing something. And, and yeah, it's just like understanding that maybe there are like some stereotypes that we have to like rethink and give different meaning to some words, right? Even like impact back in the days, I think it was like, like high impact kind of campaign. Even this was like a different kind of take and understanding about the concept. So I think it's like a moment of like rephrasing and redefining these terms and actually like telling like the mainstream that we can like coexist. So again, what I said, this kind of, even of the stock exchange kind of mentality that everything is on a quarterly basis, this really distorts any kind of incentives that executives actually have whenever they're like, like driving their companies. So this would be, like a fundamental change in how we think business if we didn't have this like quarterly pressure, for instance.
Building on this, when I know you're a mentor, with some young entrepreneurs, and you have clients and you've had the chance to exchange with a lot of startup leaders, what do you feel is missing in terms of skills for young entrepreneurs to build something that is meaningful?
I think it's the essential like business tools that have been in their hand, they never really consider this like third element, which is impact. So I think that all of us who went to like business school, who studied like business somehow in university through courses, or even like entrepreneurship in several ways, there is like one essential matrix, which is like risk and return. So we have
Yeah.
like two axes. And essentially what we see is actually you have like risk, return, and impact as a third
Hmm.
dimension. So I think that it is the moment where, accelerators, incubators, business schools, like all kinds of places, intermediaries in a sense that are trying to educate entrepreneurs. We have to bring to the table that if you don't take into consideration these stakeholders, these additional fundamentals of a business, you might not be in the path, in the journey towards like full success. Because these things, even if they're like only like a kind of like risk mitigation element, they have to be part of your business model. So for instance, there is not only the business canvas, there is the social business canvas, which
Hmm. Yeah.
also brings additional components to the table, for instance, right? So I think this is like one of the elements whenever we're talking, at big stages, for instance, like Bits and Pretzels last year, and a lot because of almost like a lobby or like influence of the BMW Foundation, they brought impact as part of like the core of the whole event. And this is a mainstream kind of startup event, right? Where like tech founders just come and mingle. You have all kinds of investors also popping by. And all of a sudden you have the social development goals at the forefront of such an event. And then you have like a full stage dedicated only for this kind of content. So all of a sudden it starts like opening up the view for like entrepreneurs. So I think there is already like a lot of like resources at hand. One might need to like excavate a little bit more, but to actually come to them, because still like a lot of the role models, a lot of what the media covers, a lot of like the investors, everything's very homogeneous. So everybody still have like a mainstream within VC among, like entrepreneurs, especially here, for instance, like in Berlin, in Germany, you have like Rocket as one of the big examples of what entrepreneurship can actually like look like. So it is the moment for us to really like highlight additional ways of thinking. So I'm super glad that you also had, Lubomila on the program, on the podcast, and bring additional people that have like a different take on business, because that's what we need in the end of the day, so that entrepreneurs understand, wow, there's actually another way of doing business, right?
Yeah, because I still feel that, and maybe that's my own bias, but I still feel sometimes that the way we present to entrepreneurs, you either want to become a unicorn or you want to be a social business. And one of the things that I tend to say is, social impact or social business should be the new way. I mean, ideally the new way of running a business, right? Whether we talk about diversity, inclusion, about environmental impact, that should be how the future entrepreneurs and business leaders, how they should be equipped. And it shouldn't be a choice,
Yeah.
You're also since you're a very busy woman, so I'm not going to take too much of your time. You're also the founder of EYA. Is it EYA Impact or ELA? ELA Impact, which is a global community of women focused on developing connections and knowledge around the theme of impact investments and impact businesses. And you're also a member of the BMW Foundation Gender Alliance, which is a network-driven initiative to bring feminists together to accelerate gender equality. How would you describe the progress made or lack thereof of gender diversity, specifically in business and investment?
Wow, I'm very glad that we are touching on this topic, which is like so close to my heart, as you can already see with Ella and the Gender Alliance and some other initiatives I'm involved with. Essentially, we had been coming a bit forward, so I'm also part of like a larger group of like women in VC, which is a like even like broad definition there. We're over 2,500 women right now from like all over the world, and trying to come together, because when you look at the numbers, we're still, like less than 10%, like 15% of like GPs or like senior partners of funds. Less than 3% of capital goes to like female founded companies. So we've been seeing a lot of like progress when you look at, like the earlier stage kind of numbers, like the number of like businesses being founded by women has been increasing constantly. But unfortunately, we have still like a large gap when it comes to funding, when it comes to equity ownership, when it comes to pay. So whenever we talk about like this gender gap, it's still like very large in very various like dimensions. It's not only pay gap, it's equity gap, it's funding gap. And in the end of the day, it's also on the funder side, who is actually making the decisions. So I think we were like in a trend that was showing a few good signs. And now what concerned us a lot, and that's why we're even like having, the Gender Alliance conference now, end of the month on the 27th, 28th, which is going to be open for whomever wants to actually like participate. It's going to be online, because whenever you face a crisis, and this pandemic is really like putting everything in check, there is this tendency of the human nature of going back into the comfort zone. Like so many of the steps that we had taken the right direction, we're now at the fringe of actually stepping backwards. And this is something that we just can't allow, because it is easier when you're like under stress to make a decision. And from an investor perspective, I'm going to fund whomever like looks like me and is doing something that I know of. And then when you come to like this whole spectrum of like the female business, female economic opportunities, many men have like no idea. Like the closest relationship they have is because, oh, my wife mentioned something, or my daughter, but they actually never really felt the need. So I think this is like more than ever like a call for like the whole like investment entrepreneurial like community, that we have to make this extra effort of continuing to embrace diversity. And whenever I'm talking about gender, I get very passionate, as you can see, but it's just like the first step, you know. When we're talking about diversity, it's not only gender. We're talking not only women, right? We're talking about like all different kinds of like gender. We're talking about backgrounds. We were talking about race, right? So I
Hmm.
think it's very emblematic that we had, you know, like a couple of years ago, like the Me Too movement, and now like during Corona, we had this whole like Black Lives Matter as well, because these are underrepresented groups that have been really under like oppression for so long, and we have to embrace them if we want to have like new ways of looking into the world. And for me, a lot of the take around, you know, gender, like, I didn't like to talk about like equality. You know, I like to talk about like gender balance in a sense.
Yeah.
It's because in the end of the day, we're talking about loss of economic opportunities. You know, so for me, there are like some topics around gender that are like social matters, like violence against women, for instance. But many of them, we're talking about like being economically clever, you know, is unlocking so much value and so much potential for the economy and for society. So I think there is a lot of room to improve. And I think one of the biggest challenges that we have is really like onboarding more men. And I was glad at the beginning that you said that this is something that matters to you, because we need men as well to embrace and see that's not because men are embracing gender diversity that they're like minimizing or like diminishing themselves. On the contrary, we're just like bringing more value to the table. We're unlocking more potential for everybody. So it won't, and we can even go into like the feminist leadership, for instance, and like all the principles we can see now with so many of these, you know, country leaders that are women that have been having like a different approach to this whole crisis. And we can like learn different ways of like leadership even. And this is not only beneficial for women or underrepresented groups, it's like beneficial for everybody. So I think this is the call to action that I would leave for everybody that happens to listen to this conversation we are having, that these are things that are going to be good for everybody at the end of the day.
And I mean, for some people, gender diversity is a bit like global climate change, right?
Mm.
It's a very big issue that people don't necessarily know how to tackle. So when you talk about gender diversity, if you had like a few, based against on your experience, a few key tips or ideas to help advance the cause, are there anything that comes to mind, like concrete actions?
Yeah, there are. And we're going to be publishing very soon, like a feminist manifesto, which actually has like several of these, you know, like guidelines or principles of what we understand could bring more value whenever we're looking at gender balance in several like dimensions. But I think that the first one for like entrepreneurs, at least, is like the intentionality of trying to hire differently.
Mhm.
You know, this is something that's super practical. And
Yeah.
it doesn't mean that all the time we're going to be able to have, you know, like a 50-50 like team, but just like putting the topic on the table and like recognizing that, wow, we have some work to do. And I have to like really like look back at what we're doing as well. Like, for instance, we were trying like to hire like a VP of engineering, and we didn't have one woman applying. And I reached out to all my networks, you know,
Yeah.
and I was like so frustrated. So I recognized the challenge, but I think we have to at least, you know, bring like policies in place that make us, you know, look at this at like upfront and put like some even like targets eventually that, okay, whenever we are hiring, if there is like 10% of women, it's just like, wow, should it be so? What can we do to try to increase? And in the end of the day, I'm all about like hiring the best candidate. But eventually, if you look at your team and you have like 80% men and you have two equal candidates, same kind of background, same kind of, you know, seniority and like experience, you should give preference for the woman so that you can bring additional diversity to your team. So this would
Mhm.
be a very practical one. Another one, which is very subtle, is how you name positions, how you mention about certain names, if I can put it that way. So if one says that your client is a he, you're putting this kind of bias into everybody's mind, you know? So
Yeah.
it's he
Yeah.
or she or they, so that you always like bring this forward. It's like, wow, yeah, not necessarily, let's not take it for granted that's going to be a man. It could be a woman. And then an additional thing is whenever you're looking at a product and a service, again, with the entrepreneur's mindset, is like, would a female client understand my product exactly the same way? Or how would they use it? And like one of the examples of right now, I don't have like all the figures like exact in my mind, but the seatbelt in the car, the probability of a woman getting hurt or killed because of a car accident due to the seatbelt is much, much higher than a man. I won't be able to tell you the right figure right now because
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't designed for a woman's body, you know? And
Mm-hmm.
this is a super like simple example. And so many times whenever we're talking about like UI and UX,
Yeah.
you just like take it for granted. So like my persona is like this guy, this founder, and all of a sudden you just lose so much insight into like what could make your product so much better. So I
Mm-hmm.
think these are like just so simple ways of tackling. So what we call like the gender lens,
Yeah.
and is objectively remembering that 50% of the population is going to follow the bias that you normally would have. But what about the other 50% of the population? Are you going to disregard them? So I think that whenever we can like apply this gender lens and this impact lens at the end of the day to whatever we are developing in marketing strategies, sales strategies, product development, HR, these are things that just like make you think twice that, okay, maybe the answer is going to be it's the same, but maybe and most likely there are going to be improvements that you can do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've talked about this and with other guests about, how do you actually hire the right team? And I think you're spot on. The more diversity you have, I would say more chances of success you also got, because there's so many blind spots that we have. As you said, whether it's, the offering or just how you actually run the business. So I totally agree with that. I don't want to take too much of your time, but I want to know what's next for Conscious Growth. What's in the plan for the next 6 to 12 months?
Sure. Yeah. So we're essentially like doing like a rebranding, and that's gonna come up like most likely in October. So we are like super thrilled with the kind of partnerships we managed to create to do this like new launch, I would say. And like towards the end of the year, as I mentioned, we're gonna launch the bank account and the cards, and with a
Hmm.
special kind of dashboards for the CFO.
Right?
And this is like one of a piece of news that is going to be a teaser. So like as soon as we have like the new website on, sign up so that you can be the first one to know what we're up to. And this would be like in the coming like 3 to 5 months, and then the first semester of next year is going to be the full rollout of the banking products and services suite for like all kinds of like businesses that would like to bank with us.
Exciting. Just before I let you go, could you give us a few resources? You've talked about models or frameworks a bit earlier, but a few things that could help our audience better run their business or better measure their impact.
Sure. So I have like some resources myself, which are both available at ellaimpact.com or
Hmm.
at 2030. I don't know if not right now it's like .com. I think it's 2030.com, which is the online magazine of the BMW Foundation. So they have several of my articles published there, and also my Medium. It's also like a place where I've been like posting some different like thoughts on impact related topics, be it on like wealth management or entertainment even, and how or ways that you can approach impact to your business, be it as a corporation or as a startup. I think there are like some resources there. I always recommend going back to the Global Impact Investing Network, the GIN. It's
Hmm.
the gin.org, if I'm not mistaken. They also have like a lot of like resources around like impact investing, like strategies. They are like the place to go to whenever we're talking about like serious impact. And actually, there's also like another resource, which I think it's super cool. It's from like friends of mine based out of Canada that they created the Venture Better platform. So they want to also allow startups in general to understand a little bit better that they can take this first like step into, like mapping what their potential impact is, mapping their vision and publishing that and starting like to exchange some ideas with other entrepreneurs. So it's also like a recommended one, dear friends of mine. Yeah.
Thanks, Julia, for joining us. Thanks for your time. And we wish you all the best for the next few months.
Thank you. It was my pleasure, Michelle. Always happy to exchange.
Thanks. Bye bye.
Bye.
Thanks everyone for listening. Hope you enjoyed the show. As usual, you can find the show notes at stanina.com. Also, quick reminder, we've launched an online course called Growth Leap, Design Your Startup for High Performance and Impact. You can learn more at academy.stanina.com. Thanks a lot and see you soon.